Good evening. How are you? Today or tonight we're going to look at the third video in chapter 4. Last week we looked at that how there is unity, but yet there is diversity in the body of Christ, diversity in our functions determined by the variety of gifting that Christ has afforded to us after He sacrificed His life and rose again, defeating Satan and sin, and that these gifts that bring diversity in us should not be a cause of contention and jealousy because of the price that was paid for it. And tonight we are going to look at just 3 verses. We're going to look at verses 11 to 13, where Paul proves the point that these gifts, while they bring diversity, they also should unify us. And Paul starts this section, verse 11, with the list of gifts. Now let me tell you now, these gifts that Paul talks about in verse 11, they are not at all exhaustive. Because of the context of unity in the church, the context of conduct, Paul is talking about the leadership gifts that God has given to maintain the unity and the conduct in the church. So Paul says in verse 11, he says God has given some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, some to be shepherds, and some to be teachers. But the purpose behind giving these variety of gifts is so that the believers are empowered and strengthened. Why? To show off? To boss around? To say I am better? To look down upon people? No. Look at what Paul says in verse 12, at the end of verse 12. He says, for building up, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. God has apportioned these gifts to people, this variety of gifts to people. Why? To bring corporate maturity in the church, to serve the Lord in the church. These gifts are not for your personal good. Of course, they edify you. Of course, they help you grow in the understanding of the Lord. And when you practice these gifts, they kind of give you the joy and peace which they're meant to give. But these are more so for the common good. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, the chapter which is all about the spiritual gifts, he says, the manifestations of the Spirit is given to each one, talking about the gift, for the common good. What is that common good? The common good is the strengthening of the church. So Paul is saying in verse 11 and 12 that he has given variety of gifts. Why? So that people might strengthen one another, might equip one another to serve the Lord back. That's the reason why these gifting that is there. What is the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is the maturity of all believers. The ultimate goal of these varied gifts is for maturity of all believers, maturity of the church. These gifts, please understand, is not an end in itself. The gifting that God has given you, whatever the gifting that you have, is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. End is always the glory of God through our conformation to Christ-likeness. And in order for us to be Christ-likeness, which eventually results in God's glory, will come through maturity. And Paul, in the following verses, talks about fourfold things. 4 things for happen to believers to become mature as desired by God. The first thing he says in verse 13, unity of faith, until we all attain unity of faith. That means the saints, that is the Christians, the disciples of Christ, are united in the content of their faith. When he says a unity of faith, means that all believers are united in the content of their faith, united in what they believe in. And the second thing he talks about is a unity in the knowledge of the Son of God. What do you mean by that, Paul? The word knowledge here means or has this idea of intense knowledge, intimate knowledge. Paul is saying such giftedness should drive the believers to attain unity in their understanding, in their knowledge, in their intimate knowledge of the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And the third thing he talks about is mature manhood, to mature manhood. This refers to maturity, not just in individuals, but maturity, corporate maturity, the maturity of the church. All believers are to be built up, to be equipped, to be strengthened in the church till the time everyone attains the unity of faith, the unity of the intimate knowledge of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and maturity, till the time the church reaches perfection. The word maturity here in Greek means something that reaches its desired end. So Paul is saying that this maturity should take you to its desired end. And the fourth thing Paul talks about is the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. What does that mean? He says this means that each individual is to use their gifts till the time church reaches to a stature, to a size that is filled with the fullness of Christ. Paul doesn't want church only to grow, but to attain the size of Christ. That is, to reflect His virtues, to reflect His likeness. So if you were to paraphrase these three verses, if you were to put them in your own language, it should ideally sound like this: that God enabled or gave gifts to some to be apostles, to be prophets, to be shepherds, to be teachers, to be evangelists, so that the body of Christ, the church of Christ, is equipped, is empowered to effectively serve its purpose in this generation, in time, till the time this church reaches to its perfection, to the unity of faith, to the unity in the knowledge of the Son of God, to complete and total maturity, where the church is able to display in its life and its orientation the fullness of Christ to the world outside. You see, most of our Christian life is lived individually. But Paul's orientation is, and Paul's belief is, that Christ died for the church. He's not so much worried about the individual growth. He's more so concerned about the corporate growth. Of course, the given is that corporate growth will only happen if the individuals are growing. But more often, the problem is that we get satisfied by our growth, and our growth is not transferred, or our growth is not translated into the growth of others. So let me ask you these questions. Are you growing in maturity? If no, why? Do you see you having a better understanding of God, better understanding of His Word? Are you able to see maturity in your life in the way you relate to one another? And if you are becoming mature, is that reflecting in your home group? Is your home group getting mature? The maturity is seen as how you relate to one another, how you love one another, how you spur one another, how you provide for one another, how you walk shoulder to shoulder and carry each other's burden. And if your home group is growing, then is your church growing? Is DBF Central growing in its maturity? To the extent when people look from outside, they see the full measure of Christ. When people look in, when people peep in to this church, they look the fullness of Christ in thereof. So think about these things. Are you getting mature? If not, then challenge yourself and ask someone to hold you accountable. God bless.